Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and it's time for another viewer questions show. And before we get to the questions that are in the quote-unquote official thread, I thought I would respond to a couple of questions that were asked about my latest video, which was entitled something like Problems in the Budapest. So let me quickly get to the position that's relevant to the questions from the game Fleer today, or today. Okay, and here I had offered this idea, Queen H4. Actually, okay, now this was addressed by Georgiev as well, but I had some ideas with this. Anyway, Queen H2, King F2, Rook E5, Rook H1, and then, okay, my main line went like this. Rook takes D5, Rook H2, Rook F5, King G1, and then Bishop takes C5, something that I mentioned, and I said that this position here is clearly better for white, which I think it is, despite black's 4 pawns for the piece, his back rank problems, and white's quite active pieces are more than sufficient. And okay, after Rook H2, King H2, Bishop C5, Bishop F3, Georgiev stops here, says it's clearly better, and then I continued Bishop takes E3, Rook E1, and if Rook E5, Knight E4 is winning, and I gave the following line as an example. Rook E6, Rook E3, D5, and then Rook to D3. And white maintains 2 pieces for the 4 pawns on account of the back rank. Alright, so I had 2 questions. So one, just going back to here, Vanderer offers F5 as a possibility. In this way there's no back rank worry. That's true, and there's nothing wrong with, it's not that there's nothing wrong with F5. F5 is certainly no worse than D5, but unfortunately it's also hopeless because of Knight F6 check. So if Rook takes F6, we just grab the Rook and then play Rook to E8 check, and black loses everything. If he doesn't take the Knight, then it just runs away. Well, Rook takes E6, and then the Knight goes someplace. And if G takes F6, then Bishop to D5. So this is ultimately just as bad, or just as hopeless. So it's a good question, but it's also not going to carry the day. Okay, going back to here, instead of Rook takes D5, okay, I think I already mentioned Rook F6 check. Okay, no, I didn't. All right, so this whole thing is new. So Rook F6, and then this is from Albacu or Albasu. And so Rook F6 is his suggestion, and then he gives 2 moves from here. So he gives King E1 with some analysis, and I have no idea why he continues, since Queen H1 check, and then Rook takes D5 check, and black is just winning everything. So it just seemed to me kind of peculiar that he would continue the variation. But he also gives the much better Bishop to F3. And then his main line continues Rook takes D5, Rook H2, Rook to D2 check, King G3, and Rook takes B2. And yeah, black is up 2 pawns, his pieces are active. Okay, the bishop on C8 still has to come into the game, but that's probably not going to be such a big difficulty for him to overcome. And yeah, white is in big trouble here, losing or close to losing. However, after Rook F6, Bishop F3, Rook takes D5, this is the key, white has Knight takes D5, and this wins. So the black queen is trapped here. And white regains the material with interest and is winning here as well. So it's a good try, Rook F6 and then Rook takes D5, but this is sufficient for white. Okay, so on to the new batch of questions. All right, so quite a few of these are actually not analysis-based questions, but let's say practical questions. So the first is from, well, okay, spelled slightly different from the old Greek figure Alcibiades, so this one's with a T, Alcibiades, I guess, who's a Class D player, and says, "Hello, my name is Daniel. I have a question regarding opening preparation. Up until this point, I have limited myself to the English opening as white, and the Sicilian and Slav openings as black." Me editorializing, I wouldn't say it's really limiting. Okay, the English is you know, there's an awful lot of ways for black to meet that. I mean, C5, E5, E6, Knight F6. You can go for a hedgehog, you can go for symmetric, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And the Sicilian and Slav with black, I mean, geez, that's, you know, huge. both of those openings. So he says, I'm a low-rated player, 1400 on chess.com, and says, currently I'm trying to learn the lines in the Nimzo-Indian defense, specifically. First of all, my knowledge of these openings I currently play is very limited. I only know a few lines because I find it exceedingly difficult and tedious to learn the hundreds of variations that there are in the first 10 moves of every opening. So most of the time, if my opponents play moves that I recognize from the book openings I've learned, I can play the positions fairly well. However, when my opponents deviate from these patterns, I flounder a lot. How do you learn all the lines of any particular opening? How do you understand what moves to play when your opponent has an almost unlimited number of possible responses? Okay, well, here's what I would say about that. So first of all, it's a good reason to buy opening books. So, it's very easy to go kind of crazy and buy too much, but let's say if you're playing a couple, 2, 3 main openings with white and black, then it's not a bad idea to buy a good intro book on that. And the reason why is that an intro book will explain the basic plans. So, it would be, as you say, exceedingly tedious and difficult to try to just learn opening variations out of a book that just lists a bunch of moves with no explanation at all. Something like, modern chess openings, or even more so, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings. Or even from a database, just to follow the opening book given there. So what you do, what an opening book will show you are the basic plans. What is it that both sides are really up to? What are the key features of the position? Likewise, something else that you can do, if you don't want to get it by a book, assuming you have books or you have some access to annotated games where the games are annotated by strong players, you can look at games that are in those openings and look for the explanatory comments. What are the plans that the players are using? What does the annotator say by way of explanation? Still, another thing that you can do is to try to kind of piece things together inductively, and this is not a bad method if you have access to a good database. So, for instance, what you could do is you could find, okay, who are some of the strongest players who are using my opening, and using that on a regular basis. So, okay, in the Slav, practically every grandmaster nowadays is using it. Likewise for any of the Sicilian variations. But, find somebody. So, for instance, in the Queen's Gambit Declined, Nigel Short plays it very regularly with black. All right, or Alexander Bilyovsky, another guy who plays the Queen's Gambit Declined with black on a very regular basis. So you create a little database of their games, and you just play through them in that variation, okay, in that opening line. And what you'll see, as you're going through this chronologically, you'll see a lot of continuity, but then you'll see these little breaks. So something will change. So you can try to figure out by looking at this. So first of all, by going through these games, you'll see patterns that repeat. So not just sets of opening moves, but you'll see plans or maneuvers that occur game after game after game, and so you'll realize, okay, well, this is somehow an important idea. And then you can stop and ask yourself, well, okay, why are they doing this? What features of the position justify this? Does the opponent have some kind of weakness with his king side? Is the guy trying, maybe the guy has the bishop pair and is trying to open the board up for the bishops. Maybe there's some kind of pawn structure issue. So, if there's a pawn chain, maybe one side is trying to create some kind of lever to attack the other guy's pawn structure at the base. Okay, so think about it in those terms. And then another thing you can do is when you see discontinuity. So in other words, you see, let's say, the same variation over and over and over again, and all of a sudden it gets dropped. Well, look at the games where one side was successful against that plan and try to figure out, okay, this is what that guy was doing, and it more or less stopped that plan from being effective anymore. So, okay, now why did this guy switch? What is he trying to do in the new plan? So you can kind of approach this inductively, where you're just looking at a lot of games, generally by the same player, because you'll find more continuity in that way, and to try to figure out what the maneuvers and ideas and plans are. So I think by doing that, that'll help you, if not necessarily memorize tons and tons, it'll help you to understand what's going on, and you'll certainly be able to memorize something by seeing these ideas repeated. Now, what happens when your opponent plays something that you're not familiar with, that's not part of what you've memorized or are used to seeing? Well, again, if you're used to thinking about your openings in terms of plans, you can do two things when your opponent makes some move that seems rather odd, assuming it's reasonably far into one of these variations. One thing you can do is to ask, well, what's his plan? How does this fit with the plans that you know about, and what exactly is the plan that he's got in mind? And then you can decide, well, is it a significant plan? Is it something that I should stop, or can I just let him execute it because my plan will trump his? Another thing you can, of course, do is to try to figure out what's wrong with it. So kind of take it the other way around. So, all right, the first question you might be asking, you're kind of asking what's right about what my opponent is up to. The second question is asking, well, what's wrong with what he's up to? I mean, why is this something that you haven't seen before? Now, it might be something that the guy's come up with that's brand new, or that is out there and you just weren't unfamiliar with it. But it may also very well be that it's just a bad move, or at least an inaccurate move. And you should try to ask yourself, well, why is it inaccurate? Why is this a move that others haven't played? And it might be because it doesn't really help with the opponent's typical plans. So it might be in a given structure that black, let's say if you're white, black ought to do X, Y, and Z, that this is kind of a standard operating procedure. So if he does something completely different, if he throws Q out there, and it doesn't really help with the X, Y, Z idea, then okay, you got something for nothing, especially if it doesn't stop your own plans. So think about new moves or unexpected moves in that way. What's the idea, and what's wrong with it? So I think if you do all of the things that I was mentioning, if you approach opening study in that way, where you're trying to figure out the plans, whether you're getting them from some opening book, or from looking at annotated games, or by just trying to determine them yourself by a kind of inductive approach, that will help you, I think, considerably, not only in kind of in understanding the line. It'll help you to memorize, because it's not just that you're memorizing a bunch of meaningless moves, but you're memorizing sequences that have to do with putting these plans into practice. So it's then logical, then you understand it. So it's just like a language, right? I mean, if you just had to memorize a bunch of squiggles on a page, that would be insane. But if it's words that you understand and they form sentences that you understand, then it's not hard to memorize them at all. So the same thing in chess. When you understand what the plans are, then of course it all makes sense. It all fits together, and it's a lot easier to memorize. And again, the third point is that it helps you to. So it's not just that you understand the general ideas. It's not just that it helps you to memorize, but it also helps you to understand what to do when your opponent plays something that's different, something that you don't know as part of your general study. Okay, next question. So this is from Bystanders. And he says, after looking at the games I've lost recently, I found that in a vast majority of them, the loss came only after I got a very good position in the mid or late middle game. For example, some of games I got a winning attack, but then went astray and blundered, and it was just suddenly game over for me. In other games, I had a decisive material advantage and managed to get into a rather simple endgame with around 3 pieces for each side, not counting pawns and kings, and even then, I just made a mistake somehow and completely spoiled the win. I read in Alexander Kotov's Think Like a Grandmaster that this has to do with the fact that a player often relaxes and loses concentration when he feels his position is very good. However, just knowing this doesn't seem to help me much. I've often tried to tell myself to stay alert, but my brain just wouldn't listen to me. Do you have any advice on how not to lose a winning position? For example, how do you find the surest way to finish your opponent off when you have a very strong attack? And how do you keep up your concentration and sense of danger? By the way, my playing strength is roughly 2,000 USCF, so it's not like I lose because I blunder randomly like beginners do. Okay. If this just happens, frankly. I mean, we're humans, we all screw up. If you're watching the World Cup, you see that occasionally the players, as well trained as they are, they'll have an open kick, an open shot at the goal, and the ball will go flying, 5, 10 meters over the crossbar. Open wide receivers in NFL football just drop open passes. I mean, we're just the sorts of beings that screw up like that. So it does happen. But when it becomes kind of a habit or a pattern, sometimes there are general causes. So one big culprit can be just that you run out of energy. So I don't know what your physical conditioning is like, but that could certainly be part of it. Did you get a good night's sleep? Are you in good physical shape? Did you, have a lot of sugar during the game or before the game? Because you might have a sugar crash or a crash from your meal. So it's good to eat, especially during a tournament, a lot of a little, right? So you eat a little something, a couple of hours, you eat a little something more, have a piece of fruit, have a banana a couple of hours in, and maybe some raisins a couple of hours later, something like that, and throw away the soda, especially if it's sugar soda. So, stuff like that can be the issue. Did you sleep well? So all kinds of things like that can happen, where it's just a question of energy. Something else, maybe depending on how hard you work at the board, maybe you want to take little walks when it's your opponent's move if you have some time, just to kind of get the nervous tension out so you don't get exhausted in that way. So I think things like that can really help. Trying these little mantras, okay, maybe it hasn't helped, but sometimes that can be useful. Just saying stay alert, especially if you're the sort of person who just kind of gets overconfident and you start thinking about how much fun it'll be to show your buddies at the club this game, or how much fun you're going to have making a video on here. So definitely watch out for that kind of thing. And again, if you're that sort of person, definitely the self-talk about staying alert is just a little thing to remind you could be a good idea. But anyway, I would try some of those things, or at least ask yourself if any of those things might be the culprit. Okay, next question is from Flint Eastwood, Class C player. And, okay, actually, let me skip this because we'll get back to this, but these are all chess questions, or I should say questions about specific chess positions. So let me go to a question from Rags to Rooks, who asks about time management. So he says, I'm a reasonable player at Blitz, at least 5 minutes aside, but I find that when I get to 5 minutes in a slow game, I start to panic. By that point, we are usually well into the middle game for the first time control or the end game, and I can obviously play entire games within a 5-minute span. How does one switch their mindset to a faster time control when they've been thinking slowly and carefully all night long? In addition, he says, I play in the UK, and the time control in the league here is an awkward 35 moves in 75 minutes, followed by game in 15 minutes. I find that if I'm in time trouble for the first control, I have no chance to regroup before the second time control. So I effectively play it as 35 moves in 60 minutes, followed by game in 30. I might be able to play at the stated time controls if I were better in time pressure. Okay, well, the bad news here for you is that, there doesn't seem to be any correlation really between being a good blitz player and playing successfully in time trouble. There are great blitz players who just fall to pieces in time control when they're short on time, and vice versa. Players who are not especially great at blitz, but are able to really just muster their adrenaline in a way that makes them very, very effective when they're really short of time. And of course, there are players who are bad in both and good in both. So I would say that if, to the extent that you're not really good at that kind of that game, what you could do, one thing you can do is try to play some training games where it's with a fast time control, but not blitz. So something like game 25, game 30, where you're going to have practice at first having a bit of time to think, but then having to engage in some kind of mad scramble at the end. So that's one thing, just to try to put yourself in a position where you get to practice that. The other thing that you should just try to do is, as you, in fact, seem to suggest that you are doing, is to try to play a little bit more quickly, to give yourself this cushion for the end of the first time control, and maybe to make a note where, unless it's just absolutely desperate, not to let yourself get more than a certain amount of time behind your opponent on the clock, maybe 5 minutes or 10 at the absolute most. So things like that you can try, but yeah, I think there's no easy way to just kind of mentally switch off there. You can improve your posture. So I know certainly when I get short on time, I'm sitting very much upright at the board, and I get very intense. But So I don't know. I mean, I tend not to get panicky in those situations, but I don't know what the algorithm is. I guess what I would say again, perhaps the best thing you can do, the two best things you can do are again try very hard to avoid getting really short on time like that. I mean, if the game goes long enough, it's inevitable. But I like your idea of trying to play the first control a bit more quickly, and then again, what you can try are training games where that's going to arise. So game 25, game 30, and so on. Okay, well now let me turn to some questions about particular positions. So the first is from, as I said a moment ago, Flynn Eastwood, who asks about the Tall Gambit. So he says, there don't seem to be a great deal of videos on the subject, and it would be great to get some insight into this to be able to punish an incorrect move order on White's part. So, well, I have to say I'm not sure what you mean by the Tall Gambit, unless you mean the following. So this is from Black's point of view here. So E4, C5, F4, D5. So I'm assuming this is what you have in mind. And if so, okay, I'll say a little bit about it. But I think it's primarily, it's not so much that you're punishing White in some kind of trappy way. Rather, the point is that Black gets excellent positional compensation. So the gambit arises after E takes D5, Knight F6, Bishop E5 check, Bishop to D7, takes, and C4. So this is where it becomes a gambit. White holds on to this pawn. But Black plays E6. And the idea fundamentally is that after, for example, D takes E6, which is going to happen sooner or later, Queen takes E6, Black is going to have very nice control, thanks to a number of factors, really. But the biggest is this weakness of the D4 square. So after Knight C6, which comes sooner or later, there's this beautiful pressure on the D file. D4 is owned by Black, more or less. This pawn on F4 is not really an adornment to White's position either, as it locks in the pawn on F4. So from here, White might play Queen to E2, and further irony here. Okay, well actually Black has three good moves here, at least, and they've all been tried and played, and Black has done well. So the most obvious natural move would be just to swap queens and play Knight C6, and Black has full compensation here. He can also play Bishop to D6 and just allow this exchange. Strangely enough, this gives Black the F file, and he can also prepare E5, and so play like Knight C6, castles, Rook A to E8, E5, and again with great activity. I mean, White's extra pawn is this D pawn, but it's just not going to go anywhere. Finally, in this subline, Black can also just play Knight to C6. So, like Bishop to D6. So anyway, the point is, we're focused on compensation involving control over the D4 square. Okay, so the main move here is Queen to E2. And Black just continues unafraid with Bishop to D6. And now White has three moves that he can try. There's D3, there's F5, which is the most ambitious, and there's D takes E6. All right, well, let's start with this one, and you'll see, again, the basic idea in action. So FE6, D3, castles, Knight F3, Knight C6, castles, and Rook A to E8. And Black is preparing to play E5, again, with excellent compensation. So he's got a nice lead in development, very good central control, and White's extra pawn is backward and just very ineffective. So again, Black has excellent compensation here. Okay, let's look at the greedy F5. All right, here Black just castles, no big deal. FE, FE, DE, and Black can play Queen E8 here. Can play actually a number of moves, but Queen C7 might be best, hitting the pawn on H2. Okay, White can play Knight F3. In fact, this is, I think, the usual move. But against this, okay, it's no big deal. Knight C6. And in fact, Black, I think, has a 100% score here in this position. Knight C3 was played once. This isn't so bad. And the idea is that if Bishop H2, Knight F3, check, Knight C6, and Rook H3, and White might even be a tiny bit better here. I mean, it's a really weird position. But White seems to have achieved a surprisingly decent coordination here of his pieces. But black didn't play this to go pawn grabbing, so knight to c6 is better. All right, now if white plays, for instance, knight to b5, it's no big deal, just queen e7. If white takes, well, God bless him, we're happy with that too. We'll play rook a to e8, and again we get our favorite setup. And of course, knight to d4 is coming too. In fact, maybe we should play knight to no, if knight to d4 here, knight f5 would be embarrassing, I think. So yeah, queen takes d6, and rook a to e8, knight to d4 are on the agenda. All right, so knight f3 is probably better, but a6, again, encouraging him. Can even spend this extra tempo. White should probably just decline the offer. Black plays rook a to e8, castles, and again, unafraid, queen takes e6. The fact that we're a pawn down does not mean that we should be paranoid about exchanging pieces here. Not that we should go out of our way to trade pieces, certainly, but the compensation that black has is long term. It's not based on some kind of quick mating attack or some sort of tricks based on white's lack of development. So it's essentially trying to argue that this extra pawn that white has is not significant at all. Okay, so finally, we've looked at d takes e6, and we've looked at f5. So let's very quickly take a quick look at d3, protecting the pawn on f4. So castles, takes, knight f3, knight c6, castles, and again, rook a to e8, knight c3, and, as advertised, e5. Okay, if white takes, then it just opens the gates of hell almost against its position. I mean, black's pieces are all extremely active then. So it's probably best for white to just say, okay, thanks, I'm going to keep the board closed with f5, which is actually a pretty decent idea, hoping perhaps to achieve some kind of blockade of the light squares. So one idea might be to play bishop g5, take, this knight comes to d5, maybe this knight goes to e4, and black might even have minor worries there if he's not careful, but ultimately black should be fine. So two good moves here. You can play knight to d4, and you can also play queen takes f5. Okay, actually this question I think was from Josh. So okay, well I guess Josh is Flint Eastwood. All right, anyway, this is how I would say to handle this position. I think black is doing quite well. But again, the thing to bear in mind is that we're after long-term compensation. So there's, it's not that white makes some kind of slip and then we're all over him. Rather, it's that we have very nice compensation for the long term. Okay, the next question is from Ya Dragon, or Ja Dragon, probably Ya Dragon, who's an A player, and he asks about an interesting way of meeting the Caro-Kann. So this is from the white point of view. Okay, so we go into the classical main line here. So all of these moves are very, very, very common. They've happened thousands and thousands of times. Okay, here the old move is queen to c7. e6 is also popular, and okay, they can all transpose. Anyway, he gives knight g to f6, bishop f4, e6, and then his line continues with kingside castling. Now this is very, very rare. The main move is castling queenside. Now I'll go on to the positions that he or give the further moves that he mentions, but I have to say that this castling idea doesn't really impress me at first glance, and I'll explain why. One of the main points with castling queenside, okay, it's not just that it puts a rook on the d file and things like that, but rather white has, let's say, one big liability in this position and one big asset. The main asset, or one of the main assets that he has, is that black's king can be in a little bit of a difficulty. So generally, both sides castle queenside, or at least that was the old-fashioned approach, and the king would be relatively safe on the queen side, but in a way it was a concession too, because it left black's kingside pawns a little bit more vulnerable. After, for instance, knight to e5, there are threats to the f7 pawn, and if black takes on e5, then d takes e5, and white has this very nice so-called court grip on the king side. So after knight e5, here, and here. Okay, again, forget that there's queen takes d3. We're talking about a different position. With this pawn on e5 and on h5, it very much serves to clamp on black's own kingside structure. And in fact, one of these little puzzles, so you can make it as a breakthrough puzzle. So put white's pawns on f4 and g4. So set up a board where there's nothing but those 4-on-4 pawns on the king side. Put the kings way over on the queen side, and see if you can figure out how white can win that king and pawn ending with the pawns by themselves. So anyway, it's a fun little exercise. But the point is that by castling the queen side, white's king is generally pretty safe. I mean, there are some interesting lines where black counterattacks, but for the most part, the king is pretty safe there after castling and playing king to b1. And whatever black does with his king, it makes a concession. Black has been castling kingside recently in these variations, and at least these very sharp lines where white often plays g4 as a pawn sack and flings his pieces over the king side. Very exciting and trendy variation. Anyway, with castling kingside, the point is that now black can castle kingside and have no difficulties whatsoever with his king. So that whole potential advantage for white is just gone. The second thing is that this pawn on h5 can be a bit vulnerable. So that's the one drawback that white has in this system, is that this pawn on h5 can be a little bit of a target sometimes, and it seems to me maybe all the more so here. Okay, well, let's continue with this variation. So bishop to e7, rook a to d1, castles, rook f to e1, queen a5, a3, rook a to d8. Just in case you're curious, knight takes h5 works out pretty well in every variation but one, but that one variation is sufficient. Bishop to d2, and white just wins a piece here. So, no good. All right, so rook a to d8, c4, rook f to e8, b4, and he gives queen to b6, and he asks, what's white's plan? He says, I know d5 is a part of it. I just find it hard to discover a meaningful continuation for white. Well, I have to confess that I do too. I'd probably play for knight to e5, frankly. I don't think d5 is going to happen anytime in the near future. So I would continue to try to squeeze black with the extra space that I've got. But I really don't think white has much of anything. And in fact, I think queen to b6 is not a very good move either. I would prefer a move like queen to a6, which seems to me much more logical. And the ideas of this are to play moves like b5 and or knight to b6, trying to really puncture this white pawn wall. And if white plays a move like c5 at some point, well, then there's this delightful hole, this big gap on the d5 square that black can occupy. So here I really don't see white as having anything in the position. I mean, this just strikes me as a perfectly good game for black with no worries whatsoever. So, you can play it, but I just don't see this as really being especially promising. Certainly, I would be happy to have black in a position like this. Okay, so on to the final question, I believe, and it's about the Budapest. So we go full circle. All right, so after d4, let me flip the board around here. I'll leave the board as it is. Okay, d4, knight f6, c4, e5, takes, knight g4, bishop f4, instead of the knight f3 lines, knight c6, knight f3, bishop checks, knight c3, queen e7, queen d5, takes, f6, takes, queen d3, d6. Okay, and this is from Otkazani Let, who asks, from here on, would you rather play white or black, and what are the general strategic ideas for both sides? Well, white has the bishop here and an extra pawn, and an open b file, and black has, say that he has the two knights, and that's only partially a joke. And the reason why it's only partially a joke is because they can serve as very good blockaders in this setup. And I've had this position with black several times in tournaments, not recently, but I have played this, and I managed to win all the games I've had with it. Now, that doesn't mean that black is better here. I mean, I think, a bit higher rated in every case. So I think most of these games were against masters, but masters who were lower rated than I was at the time. So objectively, maybe white is a tiny bit better. Maybe has the standard advantage that you might think that white has just by being white, but nothing more. I don't even know if it's, let's say, a full, unobjectionably slight edge here, unobjectionable slight edge. I think, it's maybe that black has to prove that it's 100% equal, but I'm not sure that white is just better either. Anyway, little story too. I've seen Yasser Seirawan, for instance. I don't remember where it was. I think it was probably in Inside Chess when he was the editor of that magazine. I think he talked about this line and just asserted full stop that basically white is up a pawn for nothing here, and just expressed tremendous confidence in white's position. And I remember I played him a blitz game a few years ago, and I lost the game. But I lost the game because he Seirawan and managed to take advantage. But I was better, better according to the computer, just obviously better. I mean, it didn't even require flipping on the computer to see this. So I definitely understood the position very well, and to my satisfaction, it suggested that that his assessment of the variation was far too glib from white's point of view. So I think this position is entirely playable for black. And I wouldn't play it for white, not because it's bad for white, but because I would prefer, I think, these lines with knight to d2. As long as white knows what he's doing, I think black just can do nothing but sort of grovel for a draw, unless he's playing a considerably weaker opponent. So if you're playing a peer who knows what he's doing, basically, if your technique is much better, you might win the game in 60 moves, but more or less your maximum result is a draw in these variations, assuming you go into the normal lines. I mean, there are some fun gambits like f6 and d6, which are probably unsound, but or not fully sound, but at least make the game interesting. But the main line where black regains the pawn on e5 is just very, very unpromising for black, for winning chances. Anyway, this position. So what are the plans? Well, white has three plans here. One is to play e3, one is to play g3, and then there's bishop to g5 followed by e3. And, okay, the difference is, all right, if you play e3 right away, all right, castles, bishop to g5 would still transpose, but let's say bishop to e2. Well, now black gets in knight to e4. And it's a very typical idea in this line for black, in general, to swing this knight over to c5, and this other knight often goes to e5. And among the ideas, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities, but one is to play bishop e6 and try to pile up on this guy. You can even imagine h6 and queen f7 coming into play. And if black can just gang up on this pawn and regain it, then he's in fantastic shape. So black is really playing a blockading game. The bishops are very good in a position where there are levers by which he can open up the board. But if he can't open up the board, then the bishops often don't come into their own and aren't really maximally effective. So sample continuation from here, castles, bishop f5, check, here, rook a to c1, knight c5, knight to d4. Playing this knight to d4 is a very typical idea for white. Often would like to even play maybe f3, e4, and expand. I mean, he's got more pawns in the center than black does, and so if you can slowly but surely run these guys up the board, maybe swap off one or both of the black knights, then he can be in great shape. So if black does nothing but just sort of sit in his blockade, he will slowly but surely lose the game. All right, bishop to e4, takes and takes, and okay, I think black is okay. Not better, obviously, but I think black is in decent enough shape. And the f3 e4 plan is a little bit slow here and not that likely to be too effective. Anyway, I think black is fine here. Okay, so that's one plan. All right, now let's look at the immediate bishop to g5 plan. So castles, e3, h6, bishop h4, and here black can sometimes play g5, and I don't think this is so bad. It's obviously very committal, but I played this way once, I think against Con Gravanus in a Nevada State Championship many, many years ago, and went on to win, though not because of of this idea. So knight e4. White could, of course, play queen to g6 check. Black just plays queen g7. As in the tall gambit that we discussed before, Black should not be paranoid about exchanges because his compensation is long term. It's based on his knights having these very strong outposts and on White's weak queenside pawn structure. It's not based on some kind of whiz-bang attacking prospects. All right, so bishop g3, knight e4, knight to d4, knight c5, check, and again we trade. And again, here too, maybe White is a little bit better, but Black is fundamentally very solid. And I would say it's kind of short on winning chances here, but can probably maintain the position reasonably well. But I don't like this line so much. I would prefer to play bishop to g4 instead of g5. Okay, bishop e2, rook a to e8, rook b1, and now an interesting idea for Black. It's certainly not forced, but it's interesting. Is to take, and then play knight e5 and b6. And well, once again, White's pawn structure is less than ideal. He's got the bishop here. He has an open g file. On the other hand, his king is not brilliantly placed. Black is going to play queen f7 or queen e6, and then threats will start to appear against the pawn on c4 and against the pawn on f3. So I kind of like Black's position here. Again, he's not better, but I feel comfortable with Black here. Okay, and then finally, option number 3 is g3. And obviously fianchettoing the bishop. Against this, the standard procedure is to castle and play bishop to g4, and then to play quickly for knight to e5 when the knight comes to d4. So this time around, Black's setup is a little bit more aggressive. The knight doesn't rush to its blockading square on c5, and so here we have a little bit more of a migration to the king side. And of course, there's a threat to the pawn on c4 as well. So White can try queen to b1, and against this, b6 is possible, but rather than creating that hole, maybe c6 is a better choice. Queen to b3, knight h5, and so on. This happened in some game that I think Black went on to win. All right, so this gives at least some general overview of what's going on here. All right, so I hope that was useful, and again, hopefully all the answers were useful to at least the people who were asking the questions, and I hope to a few people more besides that. All right, so thanks a lot, everyone, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.